Hello, everyone. My name is Vijeta Chakraborty. I'm a senior product manager for Amazon S3, and I'm here to talk about Amazon S3 replication. Today, we will talk about what S3 replication does for you and how you can set it up. We will talk about the different replication offerings, including replication time control and the ability to replicate to multiple destinations. Next, we will take a step-by-step approach of configuring S3 replication. We will also talk through a few different types of customer use cases and replication options. And around the end, we'll do a quick product demo to show you how to get started with S3 replication. S3 replication is an elastic, fully managed, low-cost feature that automatically replicates objects between buckets. S3 replication gives you several options. For example, you can replicate within the same AWS region with S3 same region replication, or different AWS regions with S3 cross-region replication. If you need predictable replication backed by an SLA, S3 replication time control lets you replicate objects within 15 minutes of upload. Recently, we launched new features in S3 replication to address more of our customer requirements. For example, you can now replicate from a single source bucket to multiple destinations in the same or different AWS regions. You can enable two-way replication between two or more primary buckets, and you have the option to enable replication metrics and failure notifications with any of your cross-region as well as same-region traffic. What's interesting about S3 replication is that it gives you a ton of flexibility on how you want to store and access your data. For example, you can use replication to directly put objects into S3 Glacier, S3 Glacier Deep Archive, or any other storage class in the destination bucket. That way, you're optimizing on cost as well as performance for your primary and secondary copies of data. Another thing to note is that you can maintain objects in your secondary copy with different ownership. So regardless of who owns the source object, you can tell Amazon S3 to change the replica ownership to the AWS account that owns the destination bucket. You can use this option specifically to restrict access to object replicas. And of course, replication lets you make copies of your objects that retain all of the metadata, such as the original object creation time and version IDs. Replicating data in the cloud is essential for a lot of our customers. And there are various different use cases for which S3 replication is the right solution. Let's talk through a few of those. So first, there's data protection, where you'd want to store a copy of your data, maybe in a different AWS account, for protection against malicious acts. You might have data sovereignty requirements that mandate your data be kept within a certain region or country. Financial industry customers also have compliance requirements that dictate that at least one or more copy of the data is maintained in a secure region hundreds of miles away. Of late, we're also seeing more and more use cases of customers wanting to move data closer to users or closer to their compute workloads for lower latency as well as higher efficiency. Recently, we launched replication metrics and notifications for all of your replication traffic. Now you can track object spending, operation spending, and replication latencies between source and destination buckets through the S3 Management Console or on Amazon CloudWatch. Additionally, as you can see here, you can also receive replication failure events to quickly diagnose and correct any issues by enabling the notification S3 replication operation failed replication on the source bucket. This specific event notification gives you the object key name, the reason for failure, so you can specifically debug this issue going forward. Let's talk a little bit more about S3 replication time control or S3 RTC. S3 RTC helps you meet compliance or business requirements for data replication. Typically, S3 RTC replicates most objects that you upload to Amazon S3 in seconds, and 99.99% of those objects within 15 minutes. RTC is backed by an SLA that states that customers will be eligible to get a service credit in the event that AWS S3 does not meet the RTC feature commitment of replicating 99.9% of objects within 15 minutes. We see many different use cases for S3 RTC across financial services and other industries. Customers use S3 RTC for the time-based guarantee on replication. It helps them meet compliance requirements and report out the recovery point objectives at a minute-level granularity. S3 RTC also helps customers monitor the replication progress and track which operations, if any, are replicated after the 15-minute threshold. Here on the right side of this graph, you can see all of the replication metrics that come by default with replication time control. If you look closely on the replication latency graph, you'll see how the value peaks in between the replication progress and then falls back down to 0 when the source and destination buckets are in sync. S3 RTC has 3 primary events, and customers can monitor these events through Amazon SQS, SNS, and Lambda. The 3 events that we want to highlight are Operation Failed Replication, Operation Missed Threshold, and Operation Replicated After Threshold. In this slide, we demonstrate how a customer might use Operation Missed Threshold and Operation Replicated After Threshold to monitor the recovery point objective. Let's say we upload an object to the bucket at 9 a.m. Due to an unforeseen outage, our new object does not replicate to the destination region in 15 minutes. At 9:15 a.m., Amazon S3 emits Operation Missed Threshold. Object replicates to the destination by 9:18 a.m. and Amazon S3 then emits a new event, Operation Replicated After Threshold, at 9:18 a.m. Recently, we launched a new feature where now you can replicate from a single source bucket to multiple destination buckets in the same or different AWS regions. You can monitor replication progress for each of these destinations and enable S3 RTC for one or more region pairs. This ability to replicate to multiple destinations is unique in the industry and is great for customers that have geographically distributed users and want to minimize latencies for data access. Let's take a quick look at how to set up S3 replication through some screenshots from the console. Let's say you want to keep a secondary copy of your data in a different region for business continuity reasons in the event of any failures in your primary region. Your primary region is US East, and you want to keep the secondary copy in US West. To restrict access to the secondary copy of your data, you want to replicate data cross accounts, that is, from AWS account A to AWS account B. In this example, you'll want to be mindful of a few things. Number 1, you will need to enable S3 versioning for both buckets. This is true for any replication, not only cross accounts. Number 2, you will need to create an IAM role for each account and attach the required permission policies. And number 3, you will need to allow the source bucket to put objects in your destination bucket. On the console, here's what it would look like. You'll browse to your source or primary bucket and click on Management. Scroll down to the Replication section, and you will see an option to create a replication rule. Next, you come to the Create Replication Rule page, and here you first provide the rule name and enable the replication rule. Next, you choose the objects to replicate. Now you can either choose the entire source bucket or choose a subset of objects by specifying a prefix in your source bucket or object tags that identify the set of objects. As a next step, you'll choose the destination bucket to replicate to, and here you will see the option to replicate to a bucket in another account. Amazon S3 cannot replicate objects without your permission. You grant permissions with the IAM role that you specify in the replication configuration. Amazon S3 will assume the IAM role to replicate objects on your behalf. Here, I already have an IAM role pre-selected because I have other replications in this source bucket. Additionally, if your objects in the source are encrypted with AWS KMS, you will decide at this stage whether you want those encrypted objects replicated as well. And finally, you also have the option to change the destination storage class. Maybe you choose S3 intelligent tiering if you're unsure of your access patterns in the destination and want to optimize on cost. Or if you think this data will rarely be accessed, you can choose S3 Glacier Deep Archive. At the end of the screen, not pictured here, you will also see other replication options like replication time control, which we've talked about in the past, replication metrics, and other settings that we will cover later in this presentation. Let's talk through a few more options that you can set at the time of creating your replication rules. Now, there are some use cases where the customer wants to keep a secondary copy of the data for business continuity and wants to retain all versions of the data in the secondary, irrespective of what is deleted or not in the source. We see other use cases where customers want their source and destination buckets always in sync. Writes to one are replicated to the other, and similarly, deletes in one should also get replicated to the other. For this latter type of use case, we have delete marker replication as an additional replication option that you can enable. With delete marker replication, Amazon S3 will sync your deletes same as your object and object metadata between the source and destination buckets. Next, we have replica modification sync. We have customers that want to replicate bidirectionally because they expect their users to be writing to more than one bucket at a time. And that's why we now have the ability to replicate your object and object metadata changes on the replica back over to the source bucket. Again, this is an additional setting that you can apply to your replication rule to replicate bidirectionally. In addition to this, customers also sometimes choose S3 RTC to ensure that writes in both of the buckets are synced with the other bucket in less than 15 minutes. Here on the left is an example of a replication configuration that you can use to maintain two active buckets, where users are reading and writing to both regions, EU West and AP East, and both buckets are acting as the primary. The two-way replication rules keep objects and object metadata in sync between the two regions. Notice the three options that we have enabled in the replication configuration. They're all highlighted on the left-hand side. We have delete marker replication, replica modification sync, and replication time control. Now let's spend some time to talk through some customer examples. Here's our first example. We have a travel industry customer that uses S3 replication for data protection. They have their production data in US West 1 and maintain their secondary in US East 2. The customer in this case keeps their production data in S3 standard, which has all of their reads and writes. They then use S3 replication to create a secure secondary copy of this data in a different region. They replicate to a different AWS account, so the current set of applications and users don't have access to that secondary copy. The customer also uses prefix-based rules to replicate some of the production data into S3 standard storage class and the remaining data into S3 Glacier storage class. Data that does not need to be accessed but still needs to be retained goes into S3 Glacier for cost optimization. Additionally, they have enabled replication metrics and notifications to monitor operation spending and replication latency between the source and destination buckets. Here's another example of how a financial industry customer uses S3 replication to build multi-region availability for their users. Most reads and writes are made to the source bucket in US East 1, but applications will occasionally read from one of the destination buckets from AP Northeast 1. In this case, the customer is replicating to two different destination buckets with multi-destination support. The customer has enabled S3 replication time control for one of their destinations for low latency access. The other destination bucket is retained for data protection and does not need replication time control. So it only has replication metrics and notifications enabled. They also use different storage classes to optimize on cost and performance. In this case, they're using S3 Intelligent Tiering in the AP Northeast 1 region and S3 Glacier Deep Archive in the US West 1 region. Now let's take a break from the slides. I want to do a quick demo to show you how to set up replication. So here we are showing you a demo of how to configure S3 replication. You're in my AWS Management Console, and I'm going to click on S3. So these are the buckets that I have in S3 so far. We have a data protection source webinar, and then we have two new buckets as well, the data protection destination webinar, as well as the data protection destination 2 webinar. All of these buckets are empty, so there's no objects in any of them. Let's show the last one. Okay. So first things first, I'm going to enable default encryption on the source bucket for this exercise today, and then we'll see how to configure S3 replications for encrypted objects. So let's go into the source bucket. We'll go into properties, and then you'll see the default encryption tab. So right now, I want to go into that, and I want to show you what I have already done. I've already enabled default encryption on the source bucket, and I have chosen AWS Key Management Service Key, or SSE KMS. The other two options that I get here are the KMS key, I have opted in for the AWS Managed Key, and then bucket keys, I have enabled it. So as a general practice, if you choose KMS keys, we highly recommend you to choose the S3 bucket keys option because it will help you reduce your KMS costs by up to 99% by reducing the number of calls to AWS KMS for all new objects that are uploaded to your S3 bucket. I'll go ahead and save those changes. So what that will mean is that when later on in the demo, I go ahead and upload new objects to this particular source bucket, they will be encrypted by default, and we will also use S3 bucket keys for those default encryption. Another thing to note here is that enabling encryption on my source bucket will mean that the destination bucket, like these two, will inherit the encryption properties of my source bucket, including the S3 bucket keys. So I don't need to go ahead and configure default encryption on both of these destination buckets. Just doing it on the source is enough. So what we'll do now is we'll create the first replication rule from the source bucket. We'll click on Management. And then as you see here, there are no replication rules currently in the source bucket. So we'll go ahead and create one. We'll call this a test rule 1 RTC. We'll keep the status as enabled. As you see here, the source bucket is in the US East or Ohio region. Now you have an option here to limit the scope of this rule using one or more filters. So the options that you have is using a prefix or using object tags. Let's use the prefix option to restrict our replication to documents. Going down, now we can choose the destination bucket for this replication rule. We're going to choose a bucket in this account. Let's browse S3. And for the first rule, let's use this destination bucket. Now you want to choose an IAM role that S3 will use to do this replication on your behalf. Going to go ahead and say to create a new role. Now you come to the encryption section. Because we're going to have AWS KMS encrypted objects in my source bucket, I'm going to click on replicate objects encrypted with AWS KMS. Now there's two keys here to be mindful of. One is the key that is going to be used to decrypt the source object in the source bucket, and then the key that you want to use for encrypting the destination objects. So for both cases, I'm just going to go with the default option, which is the AWS managed key. So that's AWS/S3. Now you have the option to choose a destination storage class. So let's say that I anticipate that my destination objects will not be frequently accessed. So to optimize on cost, I'm going to choose standard IA. And then here I get to choose the additional replication options. Let's say I want this replication to be completed within 15 minutes of upload. In that case, I will click on replication time control. That gives me that 15-minute guarantee. You notice that as soon as we clicked on replication time control, replication metrics and notifications, that option was disabled. That's because when you select replication time control, you get metrics and notifications by default. That's not an additional option that you still need to select. For the others, I don't anticipate delete markers, any soft deletes to be happening on my source bucket, so I'm not going to click that. And I don't want to do bidirectional replication in this case. I only want to do from source to destination and not back. So I'm not going to click that either, replica modification sync. So I'm going to go ahead and save this replication rule. And there you have it. You have the first rule, test rule 1, which is RTC enabled. It's going to this destination bucket. That's the destination region for my destination bucket. You can see replication time control is enabled. We have chosen to replicate the KMS encrypted objects and the other options that are disabled. Okay. Now let's go ahead and create the second replication rule. So we're going to click on management again. And we're going to create another replication rule. We are not going to enable replication time control for this rule. It's just going to be a cross-region replication. So this is the name that I'm giving. We're going to keep the status as enabled again. Again, the source bucket is data protection source webinar. This is my source region. And this time I want to use another prefix to limit the scope of this rule. And I'm going to say pictures is the prefix that I want to use. Coming to destination, I will choose a bucket in my AWS account. I'm going to browse S3, and this time this is the new destination bucket that I'm going to choose. So I want you all to be mindful of this this notification here for IAM role. So because we're replicating from one source bucket to multiple destination buckets, you want to make sure that the IAM role that you use for the first replication has sufficient permissions to also put new objects in the second destination bucket. In this case, I'm not going to use a pre-existing IAM role. I'm just going to ask S3 to create a new role for me. But if you were using a pre-existing IAM role, please make sure you have sufficient permissions to write to both destination buckets in this case. Again, I'm going to say that I want to replicate objects encrypted with AWS KMS. I'm going to go with the default options of the AWS managed key for both the source objects, decrypting the source objects and encrypting the destination objects. I'll keep the destination storage class the same this time. And in the additional replication options, let's go ahead and click on replication metrics and notification this time, because we don't need replication time control for the second rule. We are okay if it takes a little bit longer, but we do want to track the replication latency and byte spending and operation pending metrics, which is why we clicked on this additional setting. Again, I don't anticipate delete markers or bidirectional replication, so I'll keep those two unchecked. And then I'll go ahead and save this rule. So there you go. Now you have test rule 1, which is replication time control enabled. And then you have test rule 2, which does not have replication time control enabled. And this is quite common. You will see customers limiting the scope of replication by using prefix and tags. And then each of the rules can have different sort of replication settings. Some can be replication time control enabled. Some can be not enabled with replication time control and only metrics like we did today. And people can play around with that. That's a lot of flexibility that they have. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 different prefixes in the source bucket, and we'll go ahead and upload new objects in both of those prefix structures. So let's create documents as the first prefix. We'll enable server-side encryption, and then again choose KMS. And inside that prefix, we're going to upload new objects from my computer. So let's upload those. Okay, so that's done. One of my prefixes is done. Let's create a new prefix called pictures. If you recall, that was our second replication rule. And again, enable encryption, choose KMS, and choose the default AWS managed key. Let's go under pictures and upload new files. All right, so there you have it. We have 2 different prefixes, documents and pictures, and under each of these, we have about 4 or 5 files that we want to replicate over to our destination buckets. Now, one thing I want to show you while the replication is taking place is the replication priority. So let's go take a look at the replication rules. And if you see here, there's two different priorities set. And it was the lower number is the higher priority here. So the first rule that we created, which was replication time control enabled, has the higher priority. And the second rule, which did not have replication time control enabled, has the lower priority. Now, because we are replicating to two different destination buckets, this number is not very critical. It's not important. But let's say we were replicating to one destination. In that case, your higher priority rule would take higher precedence over the lower priority rule. So let's say you have object foo1 that is eligible for replication for the higher priority rule. It would only get replicated with the higher priority rule. It would not be eligible for replication again with the lower priority rule. So to recap that replication priority concept, if it's going to the same destination bucket, please be mindful of what you set as your priority. If it's going to different destination buckets, like in the case here, then you don't need to worry about what the replication priority is. They're going to get replicated to both destination buckets. All right. Now let's go have a look at whether the destination buckets have the objects replicated. So I've gone into the first destination bucket, which is data protection destination webinar. And as you can see here, documents folder or prefix has landed, and all the files from the source bucket have also landed in here, like we expected them to. Let's go take a look at the second destination bucket. And great, we see the prefix pictures, which was also in my source bucket, and all the images that we expected to see under the prefix pictures have also landed from my source bucket. The last thing I want to show you is replication metrics. Now, replication metrics shows up in your source bucket. So we're in the source bucket right now, data protection source webinar. We'll go ahead and click on metrics. Scroll down. And then under replication metrics, we'll choose the rules that we want to see the metrics for. So in this case, let's choose both. Test rule 1 as well as test rule 2. Display charts. So what's interesting here is that because each rule corresponds to each destination, you are able to track the replication metrics for each separate destination. So you can see what are the bytes pending, what are the operations pending, or specifically what's the replication latency for each one of your destination bucket. So these are the three metrics that you can get. You have operations pending, replication latency, as well as bytes pending. As you will see here, the operations pending had gone up to 1 as the count while my replication was in progress. And then replication latency was a little over 30 seconds, 31 seconds, while replication was in progress. We still don't have the metrics for test rule 2. It can take a little time to publish these metrics for the first time. And then you have bytes pending. Right now it's showing up as 0 bytes. So typically what you can expect from these graphs is that these numbers, operations pending or bytes pending or replication latency, will peak while your replication is in progress. And then once you refresh, they will fall back down to 0 as replication for that batch of objects completes. You can also view them in CloudWatch. as you can see them in the link here. I just did a quick refresh to see whether the second replication rule metrics have shown up or not. Not yet. That's okay. I think we get the concept. All right, so let's do a quick recap on what we showed you here. So today we enabled default encryption on our source bucket, the data protection source webinar, and we uploaded a bunch of new objects under two prefixes in the source bucket. We set up replication from the source bucket to two different destination buckets, and each of those replication rules were scoped with the prefix-based rules. So we had documents replicating to the first destination, and then we had pictures replicating to the second destination. We tried out different replication settings like replication time control, replication metrics and notifications, and we showed you how those objects landed up in the destination bucket, and we also showed you how to track those replication metrics. Thanks. Let's now go back to the slides. Okay, so to recap, we talked about a few things today. We talked about S3 replication, which is an elastic, fully managed, low-cost feature to automatically replicate objects between S3 buckets. We talked about a wide variety of S3 replication offerings like same-region replication, cross-region replication, and replication time control. We also reviewed other replication configurations like replicating to multiple destinations, replicating delete markers, and replica modification sync. And finally, we showed you how to get started with replication. We really hoped you liked hearing about these topics. Thank you so much for attending this webinar with us. Do reach out if you have any feedback or questions for us.